Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Paul Brown Show. This evening, my guest returning will be Representative Bill Faison. How you doing there, sir?
I'm doing great, Paul. How's it going?
Great. Thank you for coming back to the show. Since the last time you were here, legislation, they wrapped up a session. Tell us a little bit about what went on in that session, sir.
Well, a lot of bad stuff. I mean, really, a lot of bad stuff. When the Republicans came into office, they said they were coming in to deal with the economy and jobs. And you know, we've got a terrible crisis in jobs and the economy. We've got over 436,000 people out of work, according to the Employment Security Commission. It's over 9%. But that number is really not a true number, because the number does not include folks who've given up looking for work or who've taken part-time work. And so the real number is probably 600,000-700,000 people out of work. And although it's bad enough having an unemployment rate something like 9.4%, about 1% above the national average, the worst in the Southeast. North Carolina has the worst unemployment in the Southeast, and as bad as all that is, if you're African American, the number's about twice as bad. It's really closer to 20%. And so in the face of that, the Republicans came in and supposedly were going to deal with jobs in the economy, and they didn't. What they came to do was to go after a woman's right to control her own body and her reproductive processes. What they came to do was to go after the Racial Justice Act. Now, you know what the Racial Justice Act is. It says that if somebody is on death row and they can show that the death sentence was imposed because of the color of their skin, then the sentence is changed to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Well, who can argue with the idea that no man, no woman should face death because of the color of their skin? It's outrageous that that could even be a consideration. Well, the Democratic legislature, under the leadership of Earlene Parman up in Winston-Salem, and others, had passed the Racial Justice Act. Well, the Republicans wanted to gut it. And one of the key elements in the act was that you can use statistical data, the mathematics of modeling the world, to prove your claim. Well, this is sort of fundamental basic stuff in law. The racial discrimination cases and federal statutes all rely on statistical data to be able to show that racial discrimination has taken place. So it's an ordinary part of law. But not only that, did you know that patent infringement law relies on statistics in part to be able to prove that a patent infringement has taken place, the process by which something as nerdy as a patent is decided? Correct. Well, it's not just in law, but it's also in business. I mean, General Motors doesn't decide to build a Volt or whatever car they're building because somebody got up and had funny eggs one morning. They decide to build it because they did the math and the statistics, and they found out if they built that car, there'd be a demand for it and they could sell enough to make money. Statistics are a fundamental part of everything we do in a sophisticated society. And part of the evidence that was admissible under the Racial Justice Act were statistics. Now, it wasn't just statistics, it was also the testimony of the prosecutor, testimony of the courthouse crowd, testimony of defense crowd, testimony of jurors. All of those things could be considered by a judge. Well, anybody who's been to a court, especially one as many times as I've been as a lawyer, knows that judges decide what they're going to hear evidence on. Just because a judge can hear evidence on it doesn't mean the judge is going to decide that the judge will hear the evidence on it. And so what the Racial Justice Act did is permit judges to consider statistical evidence along with other evidence. Well, Judge Gregory Weeks down in Cumberland County had a case, probably been a month ago or more now, in which he looked at the statistics of how death sentences were imposed, and he compared the imposition of the death sentence to folks who were considered Caucasian and had light skin with folks who were considered African American and had darker skin.
Okay.
And he found that there was a statistically significant number by which folks who had darker skin received the death penalty. And he correctly said that is wrong.
Correct.
And he changed the sentence of the person who was facing death from death to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Well, the Republicans went berserk. They just thought that was absolutely awful, that a judge could consider statistics and could make a decision based on unfair treatment. And so they decided they'd take that discretion away from the judge. And they removed from consideration statistics other than those within the specific county. In other words, they tried to tie up the judge's hands in the search for the truth. Well, the truth just is the truth, and if the truth is ugly, well, it's an ugly truth and you got to deal with it. But it's still the truth, and the mathematical modeling of statistics tell you the truth about whether you can sell a vote, whether or not you can prove a nerdy patent infringement, and they tell you the truth about whether discrimination exists in the imposition of the death penalty. And so the Republicans gutted it.
What impact does that mean to the community, especially the African American community?
Well, I think the impact is profound, and I think it's deep. I don't think it's profound and deep because of the number of individuals on death row. It's profound and deep in their life. If I'm the one sitting on death row,
Correct.
It's a huge thing. But in terms of the larger community, and that's what you've asked me about, the roughly almost 2 million African American citizens that live in this state, what impact does it have? Well, on the individual life of 2 million people, probably little. But on the psyche, on the mind, on the heart of those 2 million folks, what it has to say is the Republicans don't care about people feeling like there has been fair treatment, because that's really what the Racial Justice Act is about. It's about fairness. It's about acknowledging that racial discrimination not only has existed in this state, but it exists today. And we know it exists today. And what the Racial Justice Act does is acknowledge that discrimination and set about trying to eliminate it, at least in the death penalty. Okay. And so what it says to the community, I think, is a very, very bad message. And what it says is that the Republicans running things do not care about the heart of the people and the community, do not care about a sense of fairness. It's as important as it is to be treated fair by folks, it's also important to feel like, to have the sense that you're being treated fair. Well, if they would gut the Racial Justice Act, which is aimed at fairness, then what else would they do to harm folks?
That's true.
And so, in terms of individually, what does it do to a member of the community? Except for the few people on death row and the close family members of those folks, little. But what does it do to the broader community, the almost 2 million people in this state? It does bad and unacceptable things.
Why is it so important for us to get out there to vote? I mean, because the numbers of voters that we see, they seem to be going downward.
Well, we've got a great example of why that is so important in the runoff election that just took place this past Tuesday. And the example is this. And I'm going to give you some numbers first, and then I'm going to get to the example. In North Carolina, 20.5% of the population is African American. And now, in a fair distribution, that would mean that when we start electing members of the Council of State, the governor, lieutenant governor, the Secretary of State, the treasurer, the auditor, the insurance commissioner, the Secretary of Labor, that when we're and the Superintendent of Public Instruction, I always worry when I start making this list, I'm going to leave somebody off. But if there was a fair distribution, it means that at least 2 of those posts would be held by someone who would denominate themselves as African American. And we haven't had anybody who would say, I'm African American on the council of state since Ralph Campbell left. Now, Ralph Campbell was the auditor, and since he left, we haven't had anybody who would identify themselves that way. Well, that's wrong to me. I mean, it's not fair, it's not right, it's not the way the world should be. Well, this time around, we have had candidates running that could set that straight. We have Linda Coleman, who's been selected as the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor. And we had two people running for the Democratic nomination for Commissioner of Labor. One of them is a former Commissioner of Labor, John Brooks, nice guy. And the other is a young African-American man. I say young man, I would say Marla Foster's probably in his 40s. Okay. A great guy, family man, young kids, hard-working man. I've been all over this state at political events, and I have seen Marla Foster every place I have been. He leaves no stone unturned. He has worked hard to get the nomination of Commissioner of Labor. Right now, we have a Republican Commissioner of Labor. The Commissioner of Labor is supposed to be looking after workers, right?
Correct.
Republicans don't look after workers, they're looking after business. And the decisions coming out of the Labor Commissioner's office are not for people, they're for business. And we need somebody in that office who will look after people. Well, here's Marla Foster running from the community. Here's an opportunity for the community to have two members of the community running in the general election for the Council of State. And we had the primary runoff between Brooks and Marla Foster. Right. Well, the community's 38% of the Democratic vote. The turnout was less than 5%, something less than 3.7 or something like that. I mean, it wasn't much of a turnout.
Correct.
Which means that if you organize just a little bit, and if you've got an organization to do it, you can control the vote because anybody else but your crowd's showing up. So in that light, given the churches and the organizations within the churches, given the dynamic structure of OFA, I figured my good friend Marla Foster was a shoo-in to be the candidate for Commissioner of Labor. And he didn't win. He lost. How can the community let a young, dynamic leader within the community who on the Democratic ticket could bring the community's representation on the Council of State in parity? We're not talking about getting ahead, we're just talking about parity. How could they let that pass by, that opportunity pass by? You don't get those kind of opportunities very often. And when in life you've got those kinds of opportunities, you got to seize the day, carpe diem, get it by the throat. And it didn't happen. Marlo lost, and he didn't lose because he didn't work, he worked his head off. And he didn't lose because he isn't a good candidate, he's a great candidate. And I'm not knocking Mr. Brooks, and I'm going to support Mr. Brooks in the fall. He's our Democratic nominee, I'm with him.
Correct.
But what I'm saying is the community had an opportunity to put in place a leader, a valuable member of the community who can, whether he wins or loses, is going to advance the interests of the state and is going to advance the interest of the community. You know, in politics, not everybody wins the first time. Even Ronald Reagan didn't win the first time he ran, he lost. But he came back to be a very popular president. Yes, got his butt kicked the first time he ever ran. I remember when it happened. The only person, in fact, I think he may have done worse than George Wallace in the daggum election, and then came back to get elected. So the fact that somebody doesn't get elected isn't going to ultimately be a knock on them, but you got to be out there to get in the process. Well, Marla Foster was out there, and of course I guess it means he could come back and try again, but why would he have to? The community could control the game. The community was in a position to put him in place. And if he put him in place, then there is a young man who's got life left to live and to be a leader and be a spokesman and step up and do the right thing. And for the life of me, I was sitting around Wednesday morning shaking my head saying, what happened? How could the dynamic religious organizing leaders of this state, how could the political